Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Yesterday we talked about the fact that the suggestion moderators had decided for this month to not pass anything to the devs. Now, since I enjoy looking at historical vehicles, and also there are a ton of posts on the new forum for different vehicles, I thought, alright then, I'll just make my own. So this is going to be text passed to the devs for the month of July. So we're going to have a look at aviation, ground, naval, and of course everything else. As usual, this is something that's just from me basically, so this isn't the stuff that's actually passed to the devs, but stuff that I think is pretty cool. At the same time, thank you to people from Twitch for recommending some of the articles, and also if there's something that you want to see when it comes to this series, at least over this month when we have a bit more control, make sure to stick them in. Let's get into the aviation, pass to the devs. So the first suggestion is for the B-17G, but this isn't just the standard B-17G, this is the Boeing B-17G West End, the good old SUS 42-31435. Now you may be asking, why are we talking about this one? Well, it had a very special field modification. Basically, instead of the standard turret you have under the nose, instead it has 650 cals, which protrude out of a fixed turret at the bottom. The reason why they decided to do this was to test the idea of trying to deal with head-on attacks from the Luftwaffe in a more aggressive way than just a standard chin turret. Didn't really work too well though, because there wasn't a crazy amount of ammo, probably around 400 rounds per gun, and also at the same time, because it was a fixed turret, you had to turn the whole of the B-17 to engage the oncoming fighters. And generally, you know, the B-17 was quite flexible for a big bomber, but also it meant that you had to break formation in order to do it, which obviously is not good for the overall defense. But in-game, you would just basically just have a B-17 with more guns on the front, with a bit of an offensive armament, kind of like how the A-26 works. Then I thought we would add an anti-ship glide bomb. This is the ASM-N-2 Bat, and basically there were two major variants of this bomb. You got the Dragon, which was a TV-guided version, for which an operator would use the TV image sent from the nose of the weapon and operate aerodynamic controls during the weapon's fall. And then also you have the second version that would be kind of cool, which is the Pelican variant. This variant was developed in June of 42, however would not be declared combat ready until January of 1945, where it remained until retirement in the early 50s. The military designated it as the Bomb Mk-57, but this was soon changed to SWOD Mk-9. It's quite important to note that the radar used is very early and was easily overcome by simple countermeasures, and could be confused by other ships or land masses. There are about 3,000 of these missiles, in quotes, produced until the end of the Second World War, which were most being used against Japanese shipping vessels. Noted that this is referred to as missiles, even though they have no way of providing their own energy, unlike the Frix X bomb, which is about the place. And generally, sources tend to talk about this as a bomb and also a missile, so it can be a little bit confusing with this. But the main thing is it would be a guided munition, which could be used on stuff like the PB-4Y2, the Grumman TBM, SB-2C, and even the F-4UD, which could be quite fun. Then we have the Focke-Wulf 187 AID-0. This story starts in the 1930s, where engine technology was lagging behind airframe technology, leading to many novel solutions to get the most performance out of weak engines. One of the most common solutions was to have twin engines for double the horsepower, and the Focke-Wulf 187 follows along these lines, with an airframe having as little drag as possible through a number of means. These included retractable radiators, a cockpit so small instruments needed to be put on the engine nacelles, and also no external struts. When the first prototype took to the skies in early 1937, these innovations paid off, and it was able to reach a top speed of 523 kilometers an hour, which was incredible for the era, leading the RLM to blame faulty flight instruments until it was proven. In almost every way aside from turn speed, the FW-187 was superior to the most modern fighters of the Luftwaffe. This incredible performance led to a range of prototypes being built to improve the plane, even further with the V6 having the DB600 engines and reaching 634 kilometers an hour. The most produced variant was the A-0, which was based on the the two-seater third prototype and had Yumo 210G engines. 3 A-0s were made, with them being used to defend the Focke-Wulf factories and also possible scoring some kills. Later in the invasion of Norway, they were trialled by pilots there who enjoyed the plane much more than their Bf-110s. The dream of mass production was not to be, as the Norway mission was merely a propaganda stunt to trick the Allies into believing it was entering widespread service in a similar manner to the Nürburgring. The main reasons the FW-187 did not go into production was because capable of fulfilling the role of Zestora, whereas the Bf-110 was suited to the role, and it was seen as a waste to use two valuable engines on a single-seat fighter. In this way, it was doomed by being in the middle of what doctrine defined. The USSR got the Ilyushin Il-46. This was a post-war Soviet tactical bomber developed by the Ilyushin Design Bureau, in order to meet a requirement put forth by the Soviet government in 1951. The Bureau was working on a tactical bomber project designated IL-42, when the government suddenly asked for better performance. Soviet requirements stipulated a bomber that could deliver a 3,000 kilo standard bomb load, or 6,000 kilo overload, over a range of 4,800 kilometers. This was 1.5 times the bomb load and double the range of the projected bomber. In order to accomplish this, Ilyushin himself elected to use a similar design to the proven IL-28, even though there was a project for a swept-wing variant called the IL-46S, which could have reached higher speeds. The ease of flight, manufacture, and reliability of the Beagle-type design were too attractive to ignore. The new bomber would have basically the same armament as the IL-28, although with some improvements. Like the Beagle, the IL-46 had two fixed forward-facing NR-23 autocannons, although due to the size of the new bomber, they were both placed on the starboard side rather than one each side of the bombardier. The tail turrets got an upgrade. The IL-K-8 turret mounting, also having two NR-23 cannons, had more ammunition and greater traverse angles than the IL-K-6 turret on the Beagle. Theoretically, this would allow the gunner to engage enemy fighters even if they were flying parallel to the bomber, and Ilyushin thought it would render a dorsal turret unnecessary. While it was meant to be paired with a ranging radar, the turret was never equipped as such with the actual prototype. Just as the plane got bigger, the engines became more powerful as well. The IL-46 was equipped with two AL-5 axial flow turbojet engines, developing 5,000 kgf thrust each. Because of its larger size, the plane had a unique landing gear arrangement in the engine nacelles where the wheels would fold in opposing directions. Pilot Vladimir Kokinaki's test flights of the Sol prototype in 1952 revealed that the plane flew well and met the range and payload requirements, also being able to reach speeds of 928 km an hour. As expected, due to its design similarity, the plane handled just like the Beagle. While the aircraft did pass state acceptance trials, it was never slated for production, even though the IL-46 was fitted with afterburning engines after trials, giving it better performance. The rival Tupolev Tu-16 Badger bomber still had more attractive features to the Soviets, mainly being the swept wings for even higher speed, but the bomb load and defensive armament was also superior in the Badger. Since it was unknown in the West, the IL-46 never received a NATO reporting code. For Britain, we have the Gloster F.9 40H. Sir Frank Whittle's turbojet engine designs led the RAF to issue a specification for an aircraft that could utilize the new technology. After the Gloster Pioneer, the E-2839, showed promise, the Ministry of Aircraft Production ordered Gloster to focus on developing a twin-engine jet-propelled fighter aircraft design that the chief designer at Gloster, George Carter, had conceived in 1940. The air staff was beginning to show interest in a jet engine fighter, and with their previous experience with the Pioneer, Gloster was the natural choice to produce the new aircraft. The airframe design didn't take Gloster too long to iron out, but the problem lay in the engines. The Powerjet's W2 engine, later known as the Rolls-Royce Welland, was experienced difficulties in development, so two other potential engines were considered, the Holford H1 and the Metropolitan Vickers F2. The H1's development program was proceeding very smoothly, and the engine had further development potential, so the H1 was given precedence of the Metro Vic engine. The H1 engine gave the F940 a larger nacelle than the Powerjet's W2B that powered the Meteor F Mark I. These variants would be known as the F940H. With the W2B's low power output and development delays, the H1 was chosen with priority, and the first Meteor prototype to become airborne was powered by the H1. Derated to 2,000 pound-per-F thrust for testing in 1943. Despite the increased thrust, the increased drag of the large nacelles hindered the plane's speed, and in this respect, it was comparable to the Meteor F Mark I. The H1 powered variant were either known as the Meteor F Mark II and was advertised to the RAF by Gloster in 1942 with configurations for either 4 or 6 cannons. In the end, the H1 would not power any production Meteors, despite orders being placed for a large amount of Meteor F Mark Is with Whittle engines and F Mark IIs with the H1, due to shifting priorities with the RAF's fighter production. The H1 powered Meteors was determined to have poor endurance at high altitude, and the engine was prioritized for the de Havilland Vampire, while the W2, co-opted and developed by Rolls-Royce, would power the Meteor F Mark I. Despite the fact DG-206G has an important place in history as the first Meteor to leave the ground. For France, we have the Potez-Cams 141 Antares. This was a response to a 1935 requirement of the French Navy for a long-range naval patrol aircraft. Potez, after having taken over Chantier Aéromaritimes de la Seine in 1933, found itself in a good place to try and get the contract. Cams, after all, had been a firm specializing in the building of hydroplanes, and this contract was the perfect opportunity to apply the newly acquired knowledge and try to make a profit from it. The design was drawn up in 1936 by Maurice Hurel and his team at Sartrouville. Assembly of the first prototype, named Antares, started 1 year later in 1937, and the plane would eventually have its maiden flight in January of 1938. Interestingly enough, this plane was the first hydroplane that was made by Potez, and at the same time the last military aircraft that Cams would make. The plane was thereafter flown to San Rafael, where it received its defensive armament of 5 7.5mm machine guns in several locations. In June of 1939, it was handed over to the French Navy, where it officially entered service in September of the same year. It would fly its first patrol missions on the 20th of September, and the plane performed admirably, and sizable orders soon followed. However, the outbreak of and developments in World War II made these orders scale down considerably. Command realized that long-range flying boats had a very low loss rate, and therefore a scaled-down or smaller order would suffice. Production was started, but by the fall of France in 1940, no production model was finished, and the Antares forever remained the only one of its kind. Antares became the property of the Vichy government, which painted it in colours and sent it off to Dakar to become part of Squadron E4. From here, it flew several patrol missions over the Atlantic, but no noteworthy events occurred at that time. After the Allies landed in North Africa and the Vichy French troops joined them and the Free French, the plane once again switched sides in the war. The plane would continue to fly patrols from Dakar, where on the 2nd of June 1943, it would manage to sink the German U-105 submarine. Allegedly, it's the only French-built aircraft to sink a German submarine in the Second World War, though some reports mention a second sinking in the opening stages of the war by a different type of aircraft. The plane was eventually retired in early 1944 after 1,800 flight hours, due to a lack of spare parts, much to the disappointment of the crew. The aircraft was made entirely out of metal, featuring a wing mounted on top of a funnel-like structure. The large wing had 4 Hispano-Suiza 12-wide 2627 engines mounted in its leading edge. Each of these engines provided about 850 horsepower, coming to a total output of 3,400 horsepower. These engines could push the aircraft up to a top speed of 320 kilometers an hour, which combined with a large fuel load allowed the aircraft to fly continuously for as much as 20 hours. The long wing was held up by struts coming out of the side of the hull. More struts were used to keep the additional pontoons under the wings in place, and the characteristic high horizontal tail was designed to allow as much visibility toward the rear as possible for the gunners and other crew. This crew consisted of up to 12 men, with a pilot, a navigator, 5 gunners, and various other personnel. Defensive armament seemed to have changed somewhere along the lifespan of the aircraft, as in early photos, the aircraft lacks the defensive turret on the top of the wing. That can be found in other images. These changes likely happened at the same time as the modification to the nose of the airplane. The aircraft's final defensive suite consisted of 5 weapon stations. 2 7.5mm machine guns were mounted on the forward barbets, and 2 fired from sliding doors further back on the side of the aircraft. The final gunner was situated at the top, or in a turret on top of the main wing. This turret was armed with another 2 7.5mm machine guns. Supposedly, the aircraft possessed a rather respectable bomb load of up to 900 kilograms, although with the sources that are available, that cannot be confirmed. Then we have the BAE Systems Nimrod MRA-4, which is a pretty interesting one. Basically, the MRA-4 was essentially a complete rebuild of the MR-2, with new wings, engines, engine nacelles, and avionics. The flight deck was completely brand new, with the latest technology, with the original cockpit being replaced by a glass cockpit, and observers getting new displays, with new ASW equipment. Parts of the tail had to be modified and strengthened in order to deal with the new avionics and with the changed aerodynamics that the new engines brought. The entire fuselage was refitted in order to extend its service life. With such a huge redesign of the aircraft, there were obviously some problems. Originally, the Nimrod 2000, known as the MRA-4, was intended to be an upgrade, re-engining and refurbishment of the MR-2. Originally, Flight Refueling Limited was to carry out the refurbishment. However, on inspection, it was found that the airframes were not built to a common standard, and BAE took over their work, and the airframes were moved to Woodford. These differences occurred because the original Comet airframes, which the Nimrod was based on, were hand-built, and were each different in certain ways. Additionally, the jigs, which were used to build the Nimrod MR-1 airframes, have been stored outside for decades and were beyond usable by now. There were also multiple flaws found in the wing, so these had to be completely rebuilt, and although the original wing design was kept, a new fly-by-wire system had to be developed for the aircraft, which itself brought numerous development problems. Costs mounted as delays increased, while the other order was constantly reduced, making the program less sustainable. The original order was reduced to 18 in 2002, 16 in 2004, 12 in 2006, and ultimately 9 in 2008. It was as if the situation for the MRA-4 couldn't get any worse, but unfortunately, it did. Though the MRA-4 was never involved in any accidents or incidents, its predecessor, the MR-2, was subject to intense scrutiny in the last 5 years of its service. There were 2 incidents that revealed certain flaws within the design that would then plague the MRA-4 program until its dying day. Since the aircraft was a conversion of older models, it inherited many of its flaws. These would have had to be fixed, adding further cost. The XW666 was a Nimrod R1, a signals intelligent variant of the Nimrod. On the 16th of May 1995, the aircraft was flying over the Moray Firth after some routine maintenance when the number 4 engine suffered a catastrophic engine failure. This caused a turbine blade to puncture one of the fuel tanks, causing a major engine fire that threatened to burn through the wing. Flight Lieutenant Art Stacey managed to ditch the aircraft in the Moray Firth, with his skill allowing the aircraft to safely come down, with all 7 crew members surviving, being picked up by a Sea King from RAF Lossiemouth. The subsequent Board of Inquiry suggested various improvements to the entire fleet, mainly the fitting out of equipment and structure that reduced the risk posed by fire and catastrophic engine failure. However, these weren't undertaken. You also had XV-230, which was conducting a routine surveillance mission on the 6th of September when a fire broke out on the aircraft after mid-air refueling. The aircraft succumbed to the flames and exploded, taking with it the lives of 12 RAF personnel, a Royal Marine, and also a British Army soldier. The crash was the biggest loss of service personnel in combat since the Falklands War. An investigation and subsequent inquiry revealed damning evidence of design flaws and safety breaches spanning 40 years. The coroner's report stated that the Nimrod was not airworthy and had not been since the IFR probes were fitted in the 1980s. An independent review under Charles Haddon Cave, QC, was highly critical of these involved in the Nimrod program and revealed numerous faults, 3 of which in particular being these. 1. A crossfeed duct installed on the original MR1 build that fed air from the APU to the engines was found to be a major source of ignition. Number 2. The MR2 upgrade added a supplementary air conditioning pack which increased potential for ignition. And number 3. The post-Falklands installation of the in-flight refueling probe, which greatly increased the risk of an uncontained escape of fuel. So the report was also critical of the Nimrod safety case. A safety case is basically a structured argument that is supported by evidence, that a system is able to function safely in a given environment. Haddon Cave was also critical of how the RAF and MOD had handled legacy aircraft, as funds had not been properly allocated for the proper maintenance and suspension of these aircraft, essentially stating that penny pinching was put above the safety of the personnel. Finally, he was also critical about the RAF and MOD not holding up their part of the military covenant. The military covenant is essentially an informal agreement whereby the armed services provide for the needs of the personnel are addressed to. Though having no bias whatsoever in British law, the military covenant has acquired pseudo-legal status in the years following 2001. This damning report clearly showed that the writing was on the wall for the Nimrod. With mounting delays, an economic crisis, and safety concerns regarding the fleet, the MRA-4 was cancelled in the 2010 Defence Review, and the airframes cut up for scrap. The programme has been a controversial topic ever since, and has been the source of numerous arguments and debates ever since as well. The aircraft itself, and those who worked on it, were not and are not to blame for the failure of the programme. It was the procurement system in which it was ordered. The aircraft failed because the procurement process failed, and the aircraft should not have been built in the first place. It was going to be riddled with flaws, delays and problems from the outset, and an effort to save money by using what was in place turned out to be another case of billions of pounds being flushed down the toilet, for want of a better expression. In essence, the project was dead before the conception. Those who worked on the program did as best as they could to rectify the issues and work with what they had. The Nimrod MR2 fleet was also retired, with some being preserved, with the rest meeting the same fate as their MRA-4 cousins, the blowtorch and cutter of the scrapper. The mighty Hunter had been laid to rest. The interesting thing about this vehicle is it was powered by 4 Rolls-Royce BR-710s, and also its weaponry is pretty nuts. AIM-9Ls, ASRAMs, Storm Shadows, AGM-84 harpoons, the Alarm, Stingray torpedoes, dumb bombs, and of course paveways would make an interesting setup. The Italians have the Caproni CA-355 Tuffo. In 1939, the Italian ministry dedicated to the aeronautical speciality asked companies involved in the aeronautical sector for a vehicle to be used as a dive bomber, similar to the Stuka, to be assigned to the so-called divers department of the Regia Aeronautica. Exploiting an old project gone wrong by his company, Mr. Pallavicino Cesari created and proposed his Caproni CA-335 Tuffo, a simplified version of the Caproni CA-355 Maestral, so to speak, and it was registered with the registration number MM470. On the 23rd of March 1941, shortly after its first flight, the project was abandoned, and the only example of the vehicle was abandoned and probably dismantled to get back what was possible. The Caproni 335 mounted an Isotta Fraschini Delta engine in the fuselage, an air-cooled 12-cylinder inverted V engine, still under development at the time. Despite this, the engine was used on various vehicles, among which the Reggiani 2001 and the SAI Ambrosini 403 stand out. The engine in question was capable of delivering a power equal to 850 horsepower, which allowed the vehicle to reach the horizontal speed of 490 km an hour at an altitude of 7,400. The Caproni 335 also could count on an armament consisting of 2 Breda Safat 12.7mm offensive machine guns and 1 Breda Safat 7.7 dorsal defensive machine gun. And furthermore, being a dive bomber, could also mount a bomb load up to 400 kilos. And then we'll finish off with a crowd favourite, the McDonnell Douglas FA-18A Hornet, the Navy's response to the Falcon. The design has its roots in 1966 at Northrop's Advanced Projects Office in Hawthorne, not far from Los Angeles Airport. The leader of the design team, Lee Begin, had been responsible for the F-5 fighter. With the latter established in production, Northrop was looking at ideas for a follow-up fighter which would eventually replace the F-5 and other widely used fighters on the same vintage. As in the case of the F-5, Northrop had the international market very much in mind. The first designs resembled a scaled-up high-wing F-5, with 2 engines and the same thin, minimally swept wing with leading-edge maneuvering flaps. The design evolved between 1966 and 69 in the light of market surveys and combat lessons from Vietnam. Begin's goal was to develop a relatively small fighter which could easily outturn older large-wing subsonic aircraft like the MiG-17 while retaining supersonic speed and the ability to carry large external weapons loads. The new fighter's wingspan and aspect ratio increased, the design thrust-to-weight ratio approached 1-to-1 at combat weights, leading-edge root extensions appeared and grew steadily larger and more complex with each iteration of the design. The LERX affected the airflow over the tail, so single vertical tail was replaced by twin canted surfaces. Together with Northrop President Tom Jones, Begin believed that the Pentagon's main fighter competitions of the late 1960s would lead to large and costly aircraft which most countries could not afford. Northrop was never a front-runner in the contest to develop the USAF's F-4 replacement, won by McDonnell Douglas's F-15. By 1971, however, Begin's new fighter, the P-530, was far enough advanced to be shown in the form of a full-scale mock-up at the Paris Air Show. Northrop named it Cobra because of its hood-like LERX. The company's plan was to develop the Cobra in collaboration with one or more European partners as a replacement for aging F-104s and also Mirages. Northrop fell victim to its own success in promoting the idea of the lighter, more agile fighter. Group of analysts, engineers, and aircraft or Air Force pilots, nicknamed the Fighter Mafia, managed to attract the attention of budget-conscious, innovative civilian leaders at the Pentagon. The U.S. Air Force was still unconvinced of the value of a smaller fighter, but was persuaded to sponsor a program under which 2 designs would be built and flown as prototypes. This was enough to bring other competitors into the ring, most significantly General Dynamics, which was awarded the contract to build 2 YF-16 lightweight fighter prototypes in April of 1972. Northrop, to no one's surprise, was the other winner, with a Cobra derivative known as the YF-17. By the time the prototypes flew, the stakes had been raised dramatically. The Department of Defense, facing post-Vietnam budget cuts, directed Air Force to buy 650 new fighters based on the winning LWF design, and 4 NATO nations looking for an F-104 replacement: Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark. They agreed to buy their aircraft as a single package. In the absence of credible European alternatives, it appeared that the winner of the USAF contest would scoop the European market too. Most observers agreed that the bomber builders of Fort Worth stood little chance against the Northrop, with its extensive light fighter experience and years of work on the P-530, so it was all the more surprising when the YF-16 outpointed its rival in tests and also won the USAF contest. The competition was not quite winner-take-all, however. Congress directed the US Navy to use a version of one of the LWF designs to meet its requirement for a new fighter attack aircraft, formerly known as the VFAX, but later identified as the Navy Air Combat Fighter. The Navy's requirements were stiffer than the USAF's. For instance, it called for the ability to carry AIM-7 medium-range air-to-air missiles, and the radar specification was tougher, calling for a larger antenna that would fit in the YF-16 or 17. Both factors tended to make the NACF into larger aircraft than the USAF design. Either aircraft would need a new engine. The fact that the F-16 had the same engine as the F-15 was an advantage in the USAF contest, but was of no help in the NACF. It was also clear from the outset that the Navy preferred a twin-engine aircraft. The Navy insisted that the NACF prime contractor be a company with experience in carrier fighters. GD teamed with a Texas neighbor, Vought, while Northrop joined forces with McDonnell Douglas. Of the two prime contractors, only McDonnell Douglas had recent supersonic fighter experience. The company had lately worked with Hughes on the sophisticated radar for the F-15. McDonnell Douglas and Northrop were announced as winners in May of 1975, and the first FA-18 flew in November 1978. It was a new aircraft, sharing only its general layout with the YF-17. Compared with its predecessor, it was larger, more powerful, incorporating the stronger structure and landing gear required for carrier operations. In many respects, the FA-18 was technologically more advanced than the F-16A. Its fly-by-wire flight control system used digital rather than analog processors. It used more composite materials, in the wing skins for example. It had multi-mode radar and a cockpit which used cathode ray tubes, displays, in place of conventional dial and pointer instruments. It was designed from the ground up to accept pods for electro-optical navigation and also targeting aids, and the AIM-7 medium-range air-to-air missile, neither of which would be carried by the early F-16 variants. McDonnell Douglas touted the new fighter as a true multi-role type, as opposed to the simpler F-16A. The engine used on the FA-18 Hornet was General Electric's F-404, formerly known as the YJ-101 during the YF-17 Cobra testing. General Electric was particularly anxious to make this engine successful since Pratt & Whitney was already making engines for the F-14, 15, and 16. The F-404 engines installed in the Hornet had close to the same thrust as the General Electric J79 engine, which powered the F-4. Thrust commonality was where the similarity ended between the two engines. The F-404 was half the weight, was 1/3 shorter, had 40% fewer parts, and was 4 times more reliable. It could also be installed on either side of the Hornet, was smokeless, and had the same responsiveness as the J79, although through greater range of operation. The Hornet demonstrated better than a 90-degree angle of attack, with a 45-degree angle of side slip. The J79 was one of the great fighter engines of the jet age, but the newer F-404 showed how much the state-of-the-art had advanced. The performance of the engines provided a significant improvement over the F-4 and A-7, which the FA-18 would replace. On-board fire extinguishers allowed the pilot to also put out fires quickly. The vehicle had access to a range of weapon systems, including the AIM-7Fs, AIM-9Ls, obviously the 20mm, which we all know and love, and then of course you had air-to-surface missiles, guided bombs, conventional bombs, cluster weapons, and of course rockets and external fuel tanks as well. The FA-18A will definitely be something that comes eventually, and hopefully sooner rather than later. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Millie Draper, Juan the Panda, Nick R. Kupila, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie B. Young, Peter Grayling, Jerry Provolt, Bareen, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, Derek R., and Lafouche for supporting the channel.